Hello! Today we want to make our interface functional and make the servant element a button that we can click and that applies a highlight to the button. So let's hop over to the servant element node and exchange the portrait with a button. We use a texture button. And now the servant portrait is no longer an image but a button. So let's go back to our servant element class, and first we want to create a reference to the added button. So let's create an export of a texture button, and I am going to assign the button in the graphical user interface. And now we can connect a signal. So let's add the ready function. And inside the ready function, we reference the portrait. And on the button down event, we connect a new function that we call onClick. And obviously we need to create this function. Let's do this. And inside the onClick function, we add a quick debug message to see if it works. And do a quick check. Let's click some buttons. And we see that it properly shows up in our output console. Awesome! On the next step, we want to pass the information that the button has been clicked over to the parent servant class. So let's use another signal for this. We add a signal that we call selected. And in our onClick function, we emit this signal. And now we go into our servant script. And in our servant script, we listen to this signal. And we want to create a new function for this. Let's call it onSelect. And we create a debug message to check if it works. And let's check it out in game. And if I click these buttons and close the app, then we'll see in our output window that it worked. So when the onSelect function is called in the parent, we want to toggle a boolean to true. So let's add another variable of type bool, which is initially false, and the onSelect function sets it true. Now obviously, we only want one servant to be selectable at the same time. So we got to loop through all the created servants and set all other to unselected. So let's create a new function that we call deselect, that we call for all other servants to set the variable back to false. Let's loop through all our active servants. Now we need to exclude the current object. And for all the remaining servants, we call deselect. Let's do a quick confirmation that it works. And if I click both buttons, then I should see 2 messages and not 4. And it works. Awesome. Now for the next step, we want to add some visual confirmation that the button has been clicked, and we want to rescale the button to be a little bit larger when it's selected. So let's go back into our servant element script and add a function that we call highlight. And in this function, we will add all the visual stuff to make the selection visible for the player. So for now, let's just rescale And let's go back to our servant script. And in our servant script, we call element.highlight. And if we now click the button gets larger. Now obviously it doesn't get smaller again because we haven't added this yet. So back in our highlight function, we add a quick boolean. If the boolean is on, we set the scaling to 1.2. And otherwise we set it back to 1.0. And in our servant script, we obviously need to set the boolean variable. And in our deselect, we set it back to false. And if I run the project now, it gets larger. If I click the other, it gets smaller again. Great. And if I click the same, nothing happens. Now obviously this doesn't look very good because we don't want the box to extend downwards. So let's go back into our servant element node and use the pivot offset to scale the box upwards instead of downwards. And now if we click, the box extends to the upwards direction. Great. And I just realized that the size of the container is not properly defined. So let's do this here. And if we run, we will notice that the boxes overlap each other when they get resized. We don't want this, so let's fix that too. So let's move the pivot point towards the horizontal center. And let's check out how this looks now. And the boxes now extend properly from the center, and they still overlap each other, but they do this in a way that I actually like. So this is not intentional, but I think this looks pretty cool, so happy little accident. Let's get a bit more fancy and add an actual animation for this. Okay, so first we want to create a tween variable, and on the highlight function, we check if the tween variable has already been created before, and if so, we kill it again and create a new one. Unfortunately, this is a requirement in Godot. And on the on part of this script, we set the property to 1.2 over a duration of 0.1 seconds. And on the off part of this function, we set it to 1.0. And if we now run the project, we will see the animation playing properly. So now that we got both the servant element and the servant parent class working, we can add the servant template class. So I went ahead and created a new class, servant template, and just to explain the difference between the servant template and the regular servant class, the regular servant class gets created the moment a player hires a servant, and the servant template class exists basically as soon as you start the app, because the servant template holds all the default data for a servant, and it holds the art references, etc. So the term template is actually pretty much what it is. But before we can fill this class with life, we need to go back to our globals script and actually add a reference to the scene path here. So let's create a new variable, servant template scene, with this path. And let's copy this and go back to our servant template script. And in here, we create a new static function that we call register that we will use to fill our server template with data. What we're doing here is essentially the same as we did with the servant element. We pass the globals as a parameter to this function. We return the class created. We create a variable that we instantiate from the servant template scene. And we add the newly created server template to the root node. And now all I have to do to create a new template is, for example, go back to the Spring Manager and create a new servant template with the register function that we're going to pass the globals. And it doesn't know the servant template yet because we haven't saved. Why not? Ah, okay, now it's carried over. Now what we're doing here doesn't make much sense because a servant should not be able to be created without a servant template. Because the servant template defines the servant. So let's put this up here and create a new variable that we call test template. And we want to pass the test template as a parameter to our servant creation function. Now, obviously, we need to update our servant script. So let's go there. And to the add function, we add template. And we add a new property called template. And now we just need to populate this property with the parameter we passed to this function. We save and we go back to the Spring Manager. The debugger updated and now it's correct. So let's add a quick property just to check if it works. So first we go to the servant template and add a new property. Let's call it surname of type string. And when we register a new servant template, it needs that name. And we assign the surname here. We can add a name here. Let's call it test name to our template. And if we now go to our servant script, we can now try with a quick debug message if we can get that name. So let's take, for example, the onSelect function and add a debug message. And we print surname. Let's click something and we see that the test name properly appeared. Right, so we can get all the data from the template in the servant class. I think we made some amazing progress today, so this is the point at which I am going to end this video for now. And next time we are going to populate our servant template with a little bit of properties and maybe add an art piece or two. But until then, I'm gonna go grab some food and I wish you a wonderful day and I hope to see you again next time. Bye bye!